Hey guys, welcome to my Arcane 10.1.5 guide. This guide is going to be split up into 4 sections, just like my other guides. This section will cover basic stuff, basic concepts and talents. Section 2 will look at the rotation and things to be aware of. Section 3 will be a video analysis, and then finally Section 4 will cover Mythic Plus and AoE rotation, which I will do like a good amount after the patch has already been live, since I need to play the keys myself. If you're already comfortable with Arcane and you already know what Arcane is all about in 10.1, then a lot of the stuff here is just going to be basics that you already know. But if you're new, this is the right video for you. If you already know all the stuff, then just go to the next section. Alright, so to cover the basics of this class, some of the changes that happened since 10.1, if you talk to any mages in 10.1, is that our build choice has been quite expanded. We've gained 2 extra points overall in our single target tree, 1 in Resonance in the middle section, and then 1 in Arcane Bombardment in the bottom section, which also obviously could be put into the middle section. This is actually quite good, and a lot of people underestimate this change because of the fact that these are not super high value points. They're like less than 1% DPS on single target. Barrage is like 2 point something percent of your damage. Increasing it by 12% is very minor, right? So being able to take this off and then being able to take Improved Prismatic Barrier, for example, which is an insane talent. It makes your Prismatic Barrier 10% stronger damage reduction, is a great tool. Also being able to remove Arcane Bombardment for either like Orb Barrage or like something else up here, maybe like Chrono Shift or Movement Speed. It is an option certainly for non-single target fights or for like utility. I wouldn't run Orb Barrage single target though, over this at least. Alright, this is your typical general build. You're not really going to change this that much for a single target. For AoE, you would definitely want to take Arcane Cleave at the very least, without going into like too much detail into the AoE build, because I'll talk about in part 4. But Orb Barrage has obviously also received a very large increase in power due to its rework in 10.1.5, so keep an eye on that talent. As for the basics of this spec, some of the most misunderstood concepts of Arcane is due to the design philosophy revolving Arcane Charges. People seem very tempted to basically wanting to be press Arcane Barrage, like quite often. This is very bad. If you're new to Arcane Mage, or maybe if you're like just not super comfortable with it, the number one tip I will give you is never be not 4 charges. Or, unless you absolutely cannot do anything else. To give you a concept, like to give you an understanding of how important this is, each Arcane Charge increases the damage of Arcane Blast by 93%. So a 4 stack, 4 charge Arcane Blast, like when you cast it with 4 charges already, is doing like 5 times or more damage than if it was, and be shorter cast time than if it was 1 charge, or 0 charges, sorry. So obviously being at 4 charges is super important, and we want to minimize like our time outside of 4 charges. As for talents, to go over them just very basically, a lot of these are just damage nodes, right? They just do stuff. Clear casts are faster, which is why we don't press missiles outside of clear casts. These just increase our damage. This one reads a little bait. It says consuming Arcane Charges increases your haste by 2% for 12 seconds. Stacks up to 5 times. You would think this means, oh, if I press Barrage at 4 charges, I'll get 8% haste. No, it's just every time you press Barrage, you're gaining 2% haste. Largely not a great talent. Arcane Familiar is just a buff you apply to yourself once every hour, or when you die. This is the main talent that I want people to focus on. It's quite basic. Consuming Clear Casting increases the damage of your next 2 Arcane Blasts by 20%. This is our main gameplay loop, so to speak, where the core of our rotation will basically be Clear Casting Arcane Missiles, Arcane Blast, Arcane Blast. Clear Casting Arcane Missiles, Arcane Blast, Arcane Blast. Obviously this is a very boiled down version because we have all our cooldowns that surround it, and cooldowns are all of our kit, but at the very core of it, this is where the power lies, in Nether Precision. Some other notable talents to know about are Impetus. Whenever you Arcane Blast, essentially, since you're at full charges, you have a 10% chance to get a 10% damage buff for 10 seconds. Some other ones include Slipstream, which just lets you cast Evocated missiles while moving. Don't forget about that. Mana Adept makes your Barrage regen 8% mana when you use it at full charges. This is quite handy. It's a little nice, but it's not super gameplay changing. Resonance is our what we call funnel. Arcane Barrage's damage is increased by 12% per target it hits. This includes 1 target. So if you're on single target, this just increases Barrage by 12%. If there's 5 targets, The main target takes like 12 times like 5. Well, not 5. Actually, no, I guess it is 5, yeah. 12 times 5 is like 60%. So obviously, you're getting a 60% extra damage on your main target, and then that also buffs the damage of the cleaved targets. Presence of Mind increases causes your next 2 Arcane Blasts to be instant cast. Common misconception about this does not increase the amount of Arcane Blasts you can put out in your rotation, because an Arcane Blast that's instant cast takes the same amount of time as a non-instant Arcane Blast, because you're bound to your GCD, and an Arcane Blast cast is a GCD. So you do not press this randomly. There are specific times you press this, and we'll talk about this in part 2. Nether Tempest just puts a dot. The dot damage is increased by your Arcane Charges. Pretty weak dot. It's not really that valuable by itself. Its main uses are A, that it's basically free mana. It does less damage than an Arcane Blast, even an unbuffed Arcane Blast. So you wouldn't want to be pressing this outside of your cooldowns. The main point of Nether Tempest is that it synergizes with Arcane Echo. Arcane Echo basically just is, when Touch of the Magi is up, every instance of damage you deal does a little bit extra, like a certain flat number. Nether Tempest ticks very, very often. It has like 2 parts. It has the ticking itself, and then these like little sperm bullets that shoot out of the target that land on itself. Basically, you get something like 40 hits of Nether Tempest, 32 to 40 hits of Nether Tempest, depending on your haste. So obviously, this is giving Nether Tempest like an extra 80k damage in our cooldowns, at least, you know? So it's quite a powerful combination. Looking at some of our key cooldowns, Arcane Surge is basically our big cooldown, right? You press it, it's a long cast, it annihilates your entire mana bar almost, it's like 350k, and then for the next 18 seconds, you have a lot of mana regen, a lot of extra damage. Yeah, it's a big damage buff. You will always become full mana after you press. Don't worry about this mana going down. I will note that the damage that the spell actually does itself is based on the mana that you spend. However, the cost of the spell relative to the damage that it deals, like, you know, based on your mana, is not really worth it when in compared to like Arcane Blast. So we say this is mana inefficient. So all I'm trying to say is it's not a big deal if you press Arcane Surge and you're not full mana or something like that. It doesn't matter. You should never ever delay your cooldowns or change any of your rotation because you have too little mana for Arcane Surge or something like that. That's fake. So don't worry about this damage that Arcane Surge itself deals. It's quite weak relative to our other spells in our kit. Some of our other core cooldowns would be Touch of the Magi. Basically, if anybody's played League, this is Z-ult. You put a debuff on the target, and it accumulates 20% of the damage that you deal to that target, and then after 12 seconds it explodes. It does AoE, but the majority of the damage is on the single target. Yeah. For all intents and purposes, this is a 20% damage buff, essentially. But it explodes at the end for all the damage. This is great for timing for things like ads. So if you ever want to do like maximum damage, a lot of times you want to be thinking about making your Touch of the Magi explode on ads. But with the current rotation that we have nowadays, you don't really want to hold your cooldowns for anything, so I wouldn't stress it that much. Sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes not. It's more advanced, but yeah. Mana Gem, the world's most hated cooldown. You can conjure these gems. 3 charges, you press one, it gives you a bunch of mana and 5% spell damage for 12 seconds. Hold up to 3 charges, which means after 3 charges you have to create new ones in the middle of the fight. Yes, it's worth it, even though it's a 2.5 second cast and costs a lot of mana. We just don't have the technology to have more than 3 charges, unfortunately. But alas, that is that. The way you use the spell is you basically macro it to a button. We'll talk about it in part 2. And yeah, it's just going to be used with your cooldowns. In case anybody's thinking, remember, we do not mana gem before Surge, because Surge is mana inefficient. It is not worth it to restore our mana just to destroy it, right? We only press this after Surge. But once again, I'll cover this later. I just want to make a note of that. This makes our barrage deal double damage, below 35% HP. I've already talked about this. These just are damage nodes, don't worry about them. Evocate, you press Evocate, you regen a bunch of mana. We do this for our bursts because of this talent here. Makes Evocate channel faster and gives you intellect for 2% every 0.4 seconds. Essentially, it's a 12% intellect buff for 30 seconds after Evocate is finished casting. Very, very strong talent. So the weird thing about this one is that on live right now, this also made it generate 1 charge. They were supposed to remove it in 10.1.5, but as of right now, 2 days, 3 days before the patch hits, it still generates a charge. So yeah, we'll talk about that in the next part though. And then lastly, we have Radiant Spark. Basically, you apply a spell. The first, like you apply this like debuff. It does a bit of damage, it's not that important. But what it does is the debuff that it applies afterwards. So the first spell you cast is not buffed whatsoever, because the first spell applies Radiant Spark Vulnerability. Once you apply Vulnerability, I'll just call it Vulnerability, it has 1 stack. The first attack with Vulnerability up, so the second cast after Radiant Spark, will be buffed by 10%, and then the next one at 20%, and then 30, and then 40, and then that's it. So essentially you cast a spell, you cast Radiant Spark, first spell, afterwards nothing happens. But the first spell applies Vulnerability. From that point on, every spell you cast with Vulnerability active is buffed by 10, 20, 30, 40% respectively. Furthermore, each spell that triggers Vulnerability, or consumes Vulnerability I should say, also does 20% of that spell's damage in a 5 target AoE around it. It's actually like to your current target and 4 targets around it for 20%. So you apply Radiant Spark, you cast, let's say, Arcane Blast, nothing happens. It's just a regular Arcane Blast. It does its damage. There's no AoE from this because there's no vulnerability yet, right? It's not buffed, nothing, no AoE. But once you do that Arcane Blast, it applies vulnerability. So now we have 4 spells that are empowered. Each of those spells will all do 10%, 20%, 30%, 40% ramping, and also each of them will do 20% of their damage AoE on the target and like 4 other targets around it. Okay? So if you want, you can think of it as like 30% on the first vulnerability stack is like 30% to the main target and then 20% to everything around it. And then the next one is like 40% to the main target and 20% around it. Third one is like 50%, 20% around it. And then the last one is 60%, 20% around it. This spell is quite short cooldown. What's important to know though is it's not actually worth casting on cooldown. This is basically damage neutral to cast. What I mean by this is by itself, whether you cast it or not, you're actually going to do the same amount of damage. The lore behind it is basically just that it consumes a lot of mana to cast 4 Arcane Blast, 5 Arcane Blasts in a row. And also, you're gaining all these buffs to Arcane Blast, but you're spending a global to apply Radiant Spark that is not an Arcane Blast, right? So you're losing an Arcane Blast in return. So it's pretty damage neutral to cast alone, but obviously it's very, very good to cast with the rest of our cooldowns. The general gameplay style of Arcane is very like flow-like. It's cyclic. You master one rotation, one 1 minute 20 window, and then you just repeat that for the entirety of the time. But that is pretty much all the basics that I wanted to talk about. Anything else you want to know, any kind of basics, will basically just are self-explanatory if you read the abilities. Like Arcane Explosion or something, does damage around it. I don't need to explain that to you. But yeah, I will see you in the next part for Rotation Talk.